If you have a Bible and you find it helpful to follow along, please turn it to Exodus chapter 3. This is the place where we'll spend our time. This is one of the Bible stories that, as I recollect growing up, I learned first, which was Moses and the burning bush. And it, like so many stories like this, as I recollect them and grew up with them, even though I didn't really connect with them once I became old enough to understand that God was real, I look at stories like this and they just become so familiar that the impact of the story is kind of long past. It doesn't have the impact any longer in our lives that it should have, and there's a lot here that's very impactful. So let's take a look at the text wherein we're reading Exodus chapter 3. I'll begin reading in verse 1. The whole of the Old Testament is a record of the maker of the universe and his encounter with a people. That's what the whole narrative is. Let's take a look at it here in verse 1. Moses was shepherding the flocks of his father-in-law Jethro, the priest of Midian. He led the flock to the far side of the desert and came to a mountain of God, the mountain of God, called Horeb. The angel of the Lord appeared to Moses in a flame of fire within a bush. Moses looked, and the bush was ablaze with fire, but it was not being consumed. So Moses thought, I'll turn aside to see this. Why does the bush not burn up? When the Lord saw that Moses had turned aside to look, God called to him from within the bush and said, Moses, Moses. I've always imagined, in the movies, that's got a lot of reverb and stuff on it. It's real majestic sounding. So Moses said, here I am. God said, don't approach any closer. Take your sandals off your feet, for the ground upon which you stand is holy ground. He added, I'm the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. And Moses hid his face because he was afraid to look at God. The Lord said, I have surely seen the affliction of my people who are in Egypt. I've heard their cry because of their taskmasters, for I know their sorrows. I have come down to deliver them from the hand of the Egyptians, and to bring them up from the land to a land that is both good and spacious, a land flowing with milk and honey, to the region of the Canaanites, the Hittites, the Amorites, the Perizzites, the Hivites, and the Jebusites. Now indeed, the cry of the Israelites has come up to me, and I have seen how severely the Egyptians oppressed them. So now go, and I will send you to Pharaoh to bring my people, the Israelites, out of Egypt. Moses said to God, who am I that I should go to Pharaoh, or that I should bring the Israelites out of Egypt? God said, surely I'll be with you, and this will be a sign to you that I've sent you. When you bring the people out of Egypt, you will serve God on this mountain. Moses said to God, well, if I go to the Israelites and tell them, the God of your fathers has sent me to you, they'll ask me, what is his name? What should I tell them? God said to Moses, I am that I am. So, he said, you must say to the Israelites, I am has sent me to you. God also said to Moses, you must say this to the Israelites, the Lord, the God of your fathers, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, the God of Jacob, has sent me to you. This is my name forever, and this is my memorial from generation to generation. So Moses is in a unique spot here in his life. This is a kind of a sabbatical in some measure. He has taken a vacation from purpose in some ways here. According to the narrative, we're in a second 40-year juncture of Moses' section of Moses' life. He is 40 years. He was raised in Pharaoh's palace, educated in all of the Egyptian wisdom. If you go to Acts chapter 7, that's exactly what it says. Moses was educated in Egyptian wisdom. Moses is a man of letters. Moses is equipped to do all kinds of things. And then, of course, you know the backstory. He kills an Egyptian who's whipping one of the other Hebrew slaves. He kills that Egyptian and then flees north to Midian, wherein he meets his wife and becomes a sheep herder for 40 years, herding the flocks of Jethro, his father-in-law. And this, to me, is a picture of something that I want to spend a little time on. There are three principles here I want to look at from Moses' life that I think are very applicable to our lives. Moses has checked out of life. That's why he went to Midian. He's got all this education. He's obviously a person of purpose in that he killed the Egyptian that was beating the other Hebrew slave. But he has fled now this purpose and become a sheep herder because he essentially just wants to check out of life and find something where he can just sit back and enjoy life. So the first principle I want to think about as we look at Moses' life is, how do we see life in its progression for ourselves? Now, the American way is this, and this, I'm not criticizing this, I mean, I'm right where you are. The American way is work at something as a means to an end. That is, as a means of an income and care for your family and whatever, and care for yourself and to acquire, and then reach a certain spot. And as a friend of mine said to me years ago, I've worked long enough now, it's time for me to kick back. And I thought, well, I mean, I can understand that. But when you think about that, it's strange. Because it says that all of my life, or all of our lives, up to this spot has been, in essence, a lesser life. Right? Because all of that was just something we endured to get to a spot in life where we could then kick back. And I just look at that and I say, that's exactly what's going on with Moses here. He has lived a life to a spot, and now he's gone to Midian so that he could kick back and watch sheep and goats and not really have to think about much of anything at all. Now, that's where the first principle is, what is our life's progression with regard to calling and purpose that God would give? How did the Jewish nation get to where they were? Well, last week we looked at that. Joseph and a famine, and Joseph and all the things he went through to finally become second in command of Egypt. And there have been 400 years since Joseph at this point in history. And these Egyptians don't know Joseph. They don't know anything about Joseph. He's been forgotten. But the Jewish nation has prospered. Now, how did they get there? Well, Joseph invited Jacob and his herds and his flocks and his brothers and his sisters and everybody to come and live in Goshen in Egypt. Well, they've grown now over 400 years until now the estimates run about 2.5 million people. They're a nation. Now, I have some sympathy here for this, for the Egyptians. I got to say that. Think about it from the standpoint of, you can go to Detroit, Michigan right now. There are neighborhoods in Detroit where you cannot go unless you're a Muslim. The police won't go in there. If somebody gets murdered, they let the Muslims handle it. They don't even bother. And you see the same thing in many cities in Europe right now, where there are whole sections of the city that are set apart in these specific neighborhoods. So think about it from the Egyptian point of view. You've got a group of people, they're different ethnically, they're different religiously, and they're 2.5 million strong in your culture. They don't share much of anything of your culture other than they happen to live there. So I can understand the Egyptians being a little worried about these Jews. So what do about it? They enslave them. That's how they solve the problem. We keep them as slaves, subjugate them in this way. Now, there's a lot of history here. You may find it interesting, you may not. About 1700 BC, a group of people called the Hyksos came. They were Asian Semites. And they came down into this region and they conquered what was to become Israel. Egypt had it. The Hyksos took it, and then Egypt took it back. And during this period of time, you have, we think, dating-wise, somewhere in there, Moses showing up in the palace. And you know the backstory there. The Jews got to a certain size. The Egyptians got nervous about them, which I fully understand. So they said, we've got to control this population. How are we going to do it? Tell all the Hebrew midwives to kill the child if it's a boy. They wouldn't do it. So they said, well, that's not working. The midwives told them, oh, the Jewish women are so vigorous they give birth before we can get there, which of course was a lie, but I mean it worked. So the Egyptians said, okay, they're not going to take care of it, so we'll solve the problem. We will break into their homes, find these boys, and we'll throw them into the Nile to drown them. And that was how they had planned to keep it up keep the population down of the Hebrews. But you know what happened? They put Moses in a basket, floated him down the river. The Pharaoh's daughter found him, and they raised him up in Pharaoh's palace. You look at this, and the first thing that I look at when I look at the story, and I think to myself, why didn't God just bring them into what was going to become Israel from the very beginning? Why did he do that? Why did he allow them to leave the area where they were, come south into Egypt, flourish as a nation in Egypt before they were to go back and conquer the land where they had been when they started out? There's a good reason for that. This whole strip of land that becomes Israel is a land that has huge, we can't think of it this way, but in the modern sense, trade routes that come all the way from what became Babylon, that region of the world, down through into Africa. There's one of them called the Trunk Road. It's still there. And this roadway was so important, this strip of land became so important to all the people groups, till you remember the list we read in the text? The Canaanites, the Perizzites, the Hivites, the Jebusites, the Amorites, and on and on and on. These people were fighting over this land, continuously fighting over it because of its importance. All right, when Jacob comes into Egypt, they're not equipped to go into that land. As a matter of fact, it's a miracle that they were there to start with all of this warring going on. God brought them out, brought them into Egypt, and Egypt became an incubator for the Jews so that they could grow into a nation large enough that they could then be sent back to take the land, which is what we see happening as you read forward in the Bible. So they would have struggled to become a nation had it not been for Egypt. It would have been almost impossible. And you see God working through history here. Genesis 15, what does it say? The sin of the Amorites has not become full yet. So the judgment's not going to come to these people groups, even though they are sacrificing to Molech children in the fire for 1,300 years. It's not time yet for them to be judged. And so God keeps the Jews in Egypt for all these 400 years until finally they're ready to leave. He's working. So the first principle from Moses' life that I see is God's calling is forever. For you and for me, it's forever. We don't retire from his calling, ever. Second principle is God uses difficulty to produce a felt need in people. You read Psalm 73. Psalm 73 is one of my favorite psalms. You may read it and say, I don't understand, Rip, why this is your favorite, because it doesn't read like something you might equate with a favorite psalm like Psalm 23 or something like that. What it does is, Asaph is the writer of this psalm, and he says, I look around and what I see people who are wicked growing prosperous. And I see people who are trying to be yours, Lord, punished for being followers of the Lord. In other words, they're trying to live a righteous life, and they have it way worse than the people who are just totally wicked and licentious. And he says, what's going on? If you read the whole psalm, though, guess what it comes to? It comes to a place where Asaph says, but I came to the temple of the Lord. So what's going on? God is using the trials that Asaph sees to produce in Asaph a felt need for God. Now, I am convinced. How many books can you go to the Christian bookstore in my lifetime or your lifetime and see how many books that are there where you see somebody relating the story of their life where they went through something terrible, and because of that, they were brought to the Lord in salvation? I think that's the most common story there is in Christianity. Somebody goes through something awful, they cry out to God. It's kind of like what Baldy used to say about there are no atheists falling out of airplanes without parachutes. I mean, there's a certain sense in which you get to a desperate enough spot, you're going to call out to God. So God harnesses these difficulties to create a felt need. He does that with Moses. The third principle is you and I aren't ready to be used necessarily at every point in life. And that doesn't mean that just because, say, for instance, a person works at something in service to God to a spot, there may be something later on that God wants them to do that they're not at all ready to do. And so they have to be brought to that place. Moses was like that. Look at Moses. I mean, he's at the peak of his potential at 40 years old. He kills the Egyptian that's beating the Hebrew slave, and he flees to Midian. And then for 40 years, he just checks out of life entirely. But was he really checked out? I think God used that period of time in his life to build into Moses the things that he would need when he was brought back to go into Pharaoh's palace and demand that Pharaoh release the people. And I don't think he would have been ready at all had he, at the point at which he killed the Egyptian at 40 years old. That was a reactionary thing to do, the kind of thing a young man does do, right? Get in a fist fight over it. Moses was not ready. And then you see in Moses, there were 10 plagues. And Pharaoh just kept saying, no, I'm not letting them go. How would that look to Moses? I'm just going to say for what it looks like to me, it looks like a failure. It looks like 10 failures, and then the 11th spot is the 10th one is the success. 9 failures and then a success. From Moses' perspective. Because every time, not only, poor Moses, I mean, not only does he get Pharaoh to a spot where Pharaoh starts to consider letting them go, but then it makes Pharaoh so angry, Pharaoh changes his mind and makes it worse for the Jews. So Moses is the deliverer. It seems like every time Moses goes to the palace and comes out, and the frogs and the flies and everything else show up, things just get worse for us because the Pharaoh blames us for what's going on. I mean, and then when Moses does deliver the Jews and they start to travel, what do? You've brought us out here to starve us to death and cause us to die of thirst in the desert. We had bowls full of onions and leeks back in Egypt, and we're out here starving to death. So Moses is, through all of this process, he had to come to a place where he was ready for all of this. He was not ready at 40 years old. Now Moses' work, in my mind at least, culminates in one spot. You know what happened on Mount Sinai, what occurred. Moses, God says, I want you to come up to the top of the mountain. I'm going to give you the law. Moses goes up there and meets with God. There's thunder and there's lightning, there's smoke, and all the people are gathered down at the bottom of the mountain. And the next thing you know, Moses is gone for a month, and they say, you know, this Moses guy is gone. What are we supposed to do? We need a God to worship. I don't know how they did that in their heads. I will never figure out. But they did, and they cast the golden calf. And so Moses says to God, and Moses are having this conversation, and God says, you know, you better head down the mountain. Some stuff's going on down there. And when he gets to the bottom, he finds them worshiping the calf. He throws the stone tablets down on the ground. They break. God then says, I know what I'll do. I'll destroy this people. And all of this culminates when Moses was made so ready by all of the things that God had brought him through that he goes to God and says, please, you can't do that. Moses intercedes for the people. And God had offered Moses, I'll start a new nation with you. Moses says, no. What would the nations around us say, Lord, if you were to kill this people and destroy them? They would say, you just brought us out here to destroy us. So Moses intervenes for the people in this way. Look, Moses could have performed his work perfectly, just like anybody could, but there's a wild card involved, and that's the people that Moses is called to serve. And Moses can't force them to obey. Moses can't force them to believe. They've got to choose it. But you can see God working all the while in ramping up misery meters from time to time so that the people will say, you know, wait a minute, things look pretty good as we follow God. But the key here is that God never asked Moses to succeed. He never asked Moses to succeed. All he asked Moses to do was be faithful. That's all. So I offer this from Moses' life to all of us as an encouragement. God's not asking us to be heroes. He's not asking us to look like the heroes we see in the movies who wind up whacking everybody who was bad in the movie. He's asking us just to be faithful. And what you see in Moses' life is God takes Moses, who is a somebody. He's a somebody. He's a member of Pharaoh's court. And then God takes him out of that and reduces him to a nobody and then brings him back as the nobody that he can use, just like he uses you and me. Because that's what we are. We're nobodies. Who knows about us? Nobody. But God's got something for all of us to do. And he brings us back as the nobodies that can actually be used. And all he asks us to do is just say yes to him when he calls us out, and then to be faithful. How much easier could it be? What an awesome way to live a life of purpose and meaning when you've got a God who doesn't even ask you to succeed. He just asks you to be faithful. I don't know where everybody is today, but if I've said anything